On a wet Thursday evening in December 1967, the kind of early darkness that made downtown feel like it had been hurried into night, Eddie Klein stood behind a news camera on a sidewalk outside the federal office building in San Francisco and waited for a story that wasn't really a story. It was a short assignment, one of those filler segments local stations lived on, a ribbon cutting for a new public service counter, a few words from a supervisor, a slow pan across holiday wreaths in a government lobby, then back to the studio. The city smelled like rain and diesel, and the wind coming off Market Street pushed umbrellas into each other like strangers in a crowded elevator. Eddie was 28, union card in his wallet, coffee in his hands, and a habit of watching reflections more than faces, because reflections never performed for you. He'd learned that from filming street protests and courthouse steps. People lied with their eyes, but glass told the truth by accident. He rolled the focus ring and checked his framing against the building's front doors. Across the street, the windows of a closed jewelry store held the whole scene in their dark mirror. The government entrance, the small knot of officials, a few bored passers-by, the station's reporter rehearsing her opening line under her breath. The lens gave him one world. The glass gave him a second one, slightly warped, slightly delayed, more honest. That was where he saw it first. A man stood just outside the reflected edge of the crowd. Not close enough to be counted as part of it, not far enough to be dismissed as random. In the camera's real view, Eddie couldn't find him only coats and hats and the dull sheen of rain. But in the jewelry store's window, the man was crisp. Mid-40s, maybe. Dark overcoat, with the collar turned up, hands gloved, posture too still for the cold. His face was angled toward the building. But his eyes, Eddie could tell, even in the distortion, weren't watching the ribbon or the microphones. They were watching people, not the way a tourist watches a parade, not the way a bored commuter watches a delay. The man's gaze moved in small, measured increments. Door, left corner, curb, door again, like he was keeping time with something only he could hear. Every few seconds his right hand made a tiny motion near his chest, a tap that looked like nothing at all. In the reflection, it repeated with a steadiness that made Eddie's throat tighten, because repetition was the one thing a cameraman trusted. If it loops, it's deliberate. Eddie shifted the tripod an inch, trying to pull the man into the actual frame without making it obvious. The reflected figure drifted with the movement, then slid out of sight as if he'd stepped back at the exact same moment, perfectly timed to Eddie's adjustment, as though the man had felt the camera's attention, like heat on the skin. The reporter started her live intro. Eddie kept her in focus, did his job, counted her seconds, watched the sound meter bounce, and watched the glass. In the jewelry store window, the man returned, but not where he'd been. A different angle now, closer to the corner, positioned so the reflection showed him clearly while the real street swallowed him in shadow. He didn't look at the camera. He didn't look at the reporter. He looked at the building's doors again. And Eddie realized, with a quiet, sinking certainty, that the man wasn't hiding from the public. He was hiding from the lens. A car passed behind Eddie, slow, tires hissing on the wet street. Its headlights washed the jewelry store window for a half-second, brightening the reflection like a flashbulb. In that brief spill of light, Eddie saw the man's mouth move, not speaking, not smiling, not coughing, just forming a single word to no one Eddie could see. Then the building doors opened, and a different man stepped out into the rain with a plain manila envelope tucked under his arm like it weighed nothing. In the camera's view, it was just paperwork. In the reflection, Eddie watched the man in the dark overcoat tilt his head 1 degree, almost imperceptible, like a conductor giving a cue. The envelope holder paused under the awning, like any man who didn't want to ruin paper in the rain. But his eyes did something Eddie had learned to fear on courthouse steps. They checked the street without looking like checking. A glance at the news crew. A glance at nothing, then a step that wasn't toward his car or the bus stop, but diagonally, as if he'd been given a route in advance and was trying not to walk it too cleanly. Eddie kept the reporter framed, but his attention stayed anchored to surfaces, glass, chrome, puddles, anything that could betray movement. The main view hid. The man in the overcoat didn't approach. He didn't wave anyone down. He simply shifted again. Always in the reflected world first, like he lived there more comfortably than in the real one. The supervisor finished his sentence. Applause happened the way applause always happens in front of cameras. Polite, short, performative. Eddie's reporter asked one more question for soundbite insurance. Eddie's hands stayed steady on the tripod handle, but his stomach tightened when he noticed a detail so small it felt stupid to notice until it didn't. The manila envelope wasn't sealed. The flap sat tucked, not taped. That meant speed mattered more than security. The envelope holder moved along the building's outer wall, past a holiday poster in the window, past a concrete planter with a tired-looking poinsettia, and stopped as if to light a cigarette. No cigarette appeared. Instead, his thumb slid along the edge of the envelope once then again, like he was confirming the feel of something hidden inside. He took 2 steps, stopped again, and Eddie watched his reflection in the jewelry store window, warped by rain streaks, a man performing hesitation on purpose. Eddie's reporter wrapped the segment. Back to you. The red tally light on Eddie's camera went dark. Off air. The sidewalk's mood changed instantly. Officials loosened their shoulders. The supervisor's smile collapsed. And that was when the overcoat man finally moved. Not toward the envelope holder. Not toward the building. He walked toward the curb like he was leaving casual, unhurried, then veered at the last second into the shadowed mouth of an alley that ran beside the closed jewelry store. Eddie's view of him vanished completely, but the reflection gave Eddie one last flicker. The man turned his wrist and tapped once, twice, on the inside of his coat, the gesture hidden from any direct line of sight, a signal. Eddie told himself to pack up. That's what a normal cameraman did. Shoulder the gear, head back to the van, complain about the rain. But the envelope holder hadn't left. He'd stopped at the planter again. Bending slightly, posture half shielded by the poinsettia, like a man adjusting a shoe. Eddie saw his hand slide under the planter's rim, then withdraw. Then he walked away empty-handed. Eddie's breath caught. Quiet and involuntary. The envelope was still under the man's arm. In the jewelry store window, the planter's reflection showed something Eddie hadn't seen in the direct view. A thin strip of pale paper now pinned beneath the planter's base, held in place by the weight, almost invisible unless you were looking for the absence of symmetry. A drop across the street, a city bus sighed to a stop. Doors wheezing open. 2 office workers stepped on. A woman with shopping bags stepped off. Then the overcoat man reappeared not from the alley, but from the opposite direction. He walked past the planter with the easy pace of a man who had no business there, and his gloved fingers slipped beneath the planter's rim with the same smooth economy Eddie had just witnessed from the other man. In the wet glass, Eddie watched the paper vanish. The overcoat man straightened and kept walking, never once turning his head toward the camera crew. Eddie felt the air go colder. Not from weather, but from the sudden understanding that he had just filmed a performance designed to leave no witnesses, and he'd only seen it because the city had offered him a second world in reflection. He glanced toward his van. Then, against every instinct that said stay in your lane, he reached down and rolled a fresh tape into the camera. Eddie didn't follow them, not with his feet. He followed with what he had: angles, distance, and the privilege of looking like he belonged anywhere as long as a camera hung from his shoulder. He called to his reporter, made it sound routine. "I'm going to grab some street cutaways for the package." The reporter waved him off, already lighting a cigarette under the awning, more worried about getting back before rush hour than about what Eddie had just seen in a storefront reflection. Eddie lifted the camera, not fully shouldered. Not aggressive, just enough that anyone watching would file him as harmless. He walked the sidewalk with the slow purpose of a man hunting establishing shots. Puddles, neon signs, traffic lights smeared into halos by rain. He kept his body relaxed and his eyes busy, because the people who noticed patterns were the ones who didn't get to keep noticing them. At the corner, he paused, as if framing the street. In the lens, Chicago's late afternoon looked like a documentary about itself. In the periphery, the overcoat man crossed without waiting for the walk signal. He didn't loiter. Eddie turned the camera slightly, pretending to track traffic. The man's reflection slid across the glass of a diner, then disappeared behind a delivery truck. Eddie's heart pushed against his ribs. He forced his breathing to match the pace of a man working. A block later, the overcoat man entered a lobby with brass doors, an old office building with a directory board that listed insurance firms, a travel agency, a law office, the kind of building that held 100 lives and swallowed them all without caring. Eddie didn't go in. He drifted to the opposite side of the street and shot a wide of the facade, letting the camera do the staring for him. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. The overcoat man came back out, but he wasn't alone. A different man exited behind him, slightly younger, hair slicked neat, briefcase that looked too new for the rain. They didn't acknowledge each other. They didn't walk together. They didn't even share the same sidewalk. Yet their spacing was perfect, like gears that never touched but still turned in the same machine. Eddie felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. That was the point. No contact, no connection, no story anyone could tell later. He kept filming street nonsense, letting the lens drink in the city while his eyes hunted the seams. The second man crossed to a payphone under a small awning and lifted the receiver. He didn't dial immediately. He waited 10 seconds, maybe 12, then pressed 3 numbers, paused, then pressed 2 more. Eddie couldn't hear anything from across the street, but he could see the rhythm. Deliberate, coded. The overcoat man, meanwhile, stopped beside a newspaper stand. He bent, as if reading a headline. His gloved hand slid under the stack of papers only for an instant, and came out, holding nothing visible. Eddie's throat tightened. Something passed. Not to a person, to a place. The second man replaced the receiver, walked away, and disappeared into the flow of commuters. The overcoat man bought a paper he didn't open, folded it with care, and walked toward the elevated tracks. Eddie's brain screamed at him to stop, to go back to the van, to hand this off to someone whose job description included danger, but his hands were already moving because the camera had done something to him over the years. It had trained him to believe that if you could see it, you could hold it, and if you could hold it, you could make it safe. He followed at a distance, blending into the sidewalk crowd. The overcoat man descended the stairs into the CTA station, swallowed by fluorescent light and the metallic breath of the underground. Eddie waited, counting, then followed one step at a time until the city noise above became a muffled memory, and the air down here tasted like iron and old electricity. On the platform, the overcoat man stood with his back to a pillar, newspaper tucked under one arm like a prop. He watched the tracks the way a man watches for a train. But Eddie realized he wasn't watching the tracks at all. He was watching the people watching him. And then, on the far end of the platform, a maintenance door cracked open just slightly, like a blink. A janitor emerged, pushing a mop bucket. Ordinary, invisible, perfect. The overcoat man never looked at him directly. Yet, as the janitor rolled past, his newspaper shifted a fraction, brushing the mop bucket's handle, a touch so small it could be dismissed as an accident. Except Eddie had just watched an entire afternoon, built out of accidents that weren't accidents. The janitor didn't flinch. He kept moving, head down, pushing the bucket toward the maintenance corridor. The overcoat man stepped forward 2 paces, then stopped as the train screamed into the station, wind blasting through coats and hair and paper scraps. Eddie blinked against the grit. When his eyes cleared, the overcoat man was gone, and the janitor, ordinary, invisible, had vanished through the maintenance door with something new riding inside his bucket, hidden beneath dirty water, and the assumption that no one ever looks twice at the man who cleans the floor. Eddie moved before his thoughts could catch up, drifting down the platform with the lazy, bored gait of a man looking for texture posters peeling at the corners, puddles trembling with each arriving train, the yellow safety line worn to a dull bruise. He kept the camera low, cradled, not raised, because raised meant attention. And attention in this place was a currency you didn't control once you spent it. The maintenance door was closed again, flush with the tiled wall, painted the same tired off-white as everything that wasn't meant to be noticed. Eddie stopped near a mapboard, pretending to study it, and angled the lens just enough to catch the door in frame. The camera didn't care about "should I?" It only cared about light. A transit cop, blue cap, thick coat, hands like paddles, paced the platform edge. He glanced at Eddie's press badge and then looked away, satisfied. Eddie felt the irrational urge to speak to him, to say something clean and official, like, "I think I just witnessed an espionage handoff inside your station." But the words died before they formed. In 1967, you didn't toss that word around unless you wanted to become the punchline in someone else's report. He waited through one train, then another, letting minutes stack like newspapers. When the platform thinned, he crossed casually to the maintenance door and knelt, as if tightening a shoe. Up close, he could see the edge of the door wasn't fully seated. A hairline gap breathed cold air, carrying the smell of damp concrete and something faintly chemical, sharp, like soda flux. Eddie lifted the camera an inch and let the lens peer into the seam. Darkness. Then, deeper inside, a thin stripe of light, like a flashlight beam, cut by slats, moved once and vanished. Not sweeping, not searching. A practice signal. "I'm here." His stomach tightened. Behind him, the transit cop's footsteps slowed. He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out a small notepad. A train roared in, the wind slamming the platform with grit and paper scraps. In the turbulence, the maintenance door shivered just barely, and for half a second the gap widened enough for the lens to catch something reflective inside. Not a face. A piece of hardware. A small metal cylinder strapped to a pipe with black tape. It gleamed once in Eddie's viewfinder, and then the door settled back into place like it had never moved at all. The train doors opened. People poured out. A woman laughed too loud. Someone bumped Eddie's shoulder. The world resumed. But Eddie's camera hand didn't stop shaking, because now he understood what had really happened. He'd carried a node, and somewhere above them, somewhere in the city, someone was about to talk to it. Eddie didn't leave the station like a man with a story. He left like a man who'd misplaced something and couldn't remember where. walking 3 blocks in the wrong direction before correcting himself, doubling back under a marquee just to see if anyone doubled back with him. The cold kept his face neutral. The fear lived in the small decisions. Which corner to take, when to pause for a cigarette he didn't light, how long to stare at a storefront television. So it looked like he was killing time instead of checking reflections. At the nearest phone booth, he fed a dime into the slot and dialed the newsroom. Not for the police, not for a hero, just for his producer, because routine was a shield. "Lou, it's Eddie," he said, keeping his voice flat. "I need you to hold my film. Not the lab, not the intern. You. A beat. What you shoot. Something that doesn't make sense yet." Eddie answered, and hated how true it sounded. Lou exhaled smoke through the line. "You want a cab? I want you to tell the desk I'm on a quick pickup. If anyone calls asking where I am, anyone tell them you don't know. You in trouble?" Eddie looked at the booth's glass, at his own pale face hovering over the street behind him. "I don't know." He hung up and didn't go straight back. He walked to a hardware store, bought a cheap pocket flashlight and a roll of electrical tape with money that made him feel ridiculous, like a kid buying armor. Then he headed for the studio by way of places with mirrors. Diner windows, bus depot glass, the chrome curve of a parked Buick. Twice he caught the same shape in different reflections, dark coat, brimmed hat, moving at the pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. At the studio's back entrance, Lou met him with the kind of smile you wore when you didn't want the receptionist to sense blood in the water. Eddie handed over the film canister without ceremony. Lou's fingers tightened around it as if it suddenly weighed more than celluloid. "You're shaking." "Don't talk about it," Eddie said. "Just lock it." Lou nodded and disappeared into the building. Eddie stayed outside, leaning against the brick, watching the alley mouth. A delivery truck idled, engine ticking, exhaust pooling like a low fog. The driver never got out. Eddie's hand drifted to the flashlight in his coat pocket. Absurd comfort. He told himself he was overreacting, that New York was full of men in dark coats and men who waited in trucks. Then the truck's headlights blinked once, then again, like a mistake, like a driver adjusting. And from inside the building, through a window cracked for ventilation, Eddie heard the faintest sound from a monitor someone had left on, a thin, warbling hiss that rose and fell in pulses, not music, not static, something with cadence, as if the air itself were being tapped for answers. Lou reappeared, face drained. He didn't ask what Eddie had seen. He only said, quietly. Eddie's mouth went dry. "Did they say where from?" Lou shook his head. They didn't have to. The delivery truck across the alley killed its engine, and the silence that followed felt less like peace than like someone finally taking their finger off a trigger they'd been resting on for hours. Lou didn't wait for Eddie to answer. He just grabbed Eddie's sleeve and pulled him inside. Not through the lobby, where the fluorescent lights made everyone look innocent, but through the side corridor that smelled of hot cables and floor wax, past a bulletin board of union notices, past a rack of spare mic stands, past the studio door with the little red on-air bulb. "Tell me what you shot," Lou said, under his breath, voice tight with the kind of anger that was really fear dressed up in authority. Eddie swallowed. A man in the crowd. He wasn't watching the speaker, he was watching the lenses. And in his glasses, I saw a woman's hand. No ring, red nail. She flashed something, just 2 fingers, then a closed fist. It wasn't for the crowd. It was for him. Lou stared at him like Eddie had just confessed to seeing ghosts. "And the reflection?" Lou asked. Eddie nodded. "The same face keeps showing up behind me in windows." They reached the film closet, an ugly metal door with a padlock that made the whole place feel more serious than it ever admitted in daylight. Lou spun the dial, shoved the canister inside a shelf between two reels labeled Mayoral Debate and Harbor Strike, then locked it like the room contained a live animal. "Okay," Lou breathed. "So we don't develop it tonight. We don't call the lab. We don't—" A soft click came from the hallway behind them. Not loud, not dramatic, just the sound of a door latch settling. Lou's eyes flicked up. Eddie's body went cold. They were not alone in the building anymore. Lou moved first, stepping into the corridor with the practiced confidence of a man who'd thrown out drunks and angry interns for years. Eddie stayed half a step behind him, feeling suddenly stupid for having bought a flashlight, as if light could solve anything that lived in shadow. At the far end of the corridor, a man stood in a grey overcoat, hat still on indoors, hands relaxed at his sides. He looked like he belonged anywhere, like a commuter who'd taken a wrong turn and found himself backstage. "Evening," the man said, polite. Lou didn't answer. The man smiled slightly, as if he understood the etiquette of control. Eddie felt his name become a hook in his ribs. The man's eyes moved to Eddie, quick and clinical. Lou's jaw tightened. "You need to leave." "I can," the man said, still calm. "But I'd rather not." His gaze slid past them, toward the film closet door, like he could see through metal. "Mr. Caro has something that doesn't belong to him." Eddie's throat tightened. "I filmed a public event, not all of it," the man replied. "You filmed the part that was never meant to be recorded." Lou shifted his weight, positioning himself between the man and Eddie without thinking. Eddie saw it, then the same instinct he'd seen in cops when a crowd started pushing. The same stance. Protect the person behind you, even if you don't know what's coming. The man took one step closer. "No one wants trouble. Trouble is loud. Trouble invites questions." Eddie forced air into his lungs. "What do you want?" The man's smile didn't change, but something sharpened behind it. With Heverden, behind Eddie, somewhere deeper in the building, a monitor hissed again, thin, pulsing, almost musical. The man's eyes flicked toward the sound for the smallest fraction of a second. Recognition. Eddie understood in that instant. Whatever he'd caught on camera wasn't just a spy in a crowd. It was a channel, a living, breathing pipeline, and he'd accidentally filmed the valve. Lou didn't look at Eddie when he spoke. He kept his eyes on the man in the overcoat, like blinking might count as consent. "Come with me," Lou said, nodding toward the studio floor, casual as a tour guide. The man's mouth twitched, almost amused. "Witnesses are not a protection," he said. "They're just noise. Then you're like television," Lou replied, and pushed the stairwell door open. Eddie expected the man to refuse. Instead, he followed because refusing would admit urgency, and urgency was the only thing a professional couldn't afford to show. They descended into the studio where the air ran warmer, buzzing with transformer hum and the faint smell of dust baking on lights. The set was half-struck from the afternoon shoot. Podiums on casters, a backdrop of civic slogans, cables taped down in straight lines like someone trying to impose order on chaos. A single camera still sat on its pedestal, lens cap off, iris open, watching the room without a face behind it. Lou walked past the camera like it was a piece of furniture. Eddie did not. Eddie's eyes went straight to the lens, because he'd learned, in the last hour, that glass remembered everything. "Open the film closet," the man said, voice still low, still polite. Lou stopped beside the camera pedestal and reached up to the lighting grid controls. "Sure," he said, as if he'd heard a different request. He yanked the master switch. The studio lights slammed on white, brutal, flattening every shadow into nowhere to hide. The overcoat man's pupils tightened, His face, suddenly too clear, looked less like a commuter and more like a mask that didn't fit under honest light. At the same moment, Lou hit the talkback. "Control," he said into the dead air. "Put camera 2 online. Now." A crackle. A sleepy voice. "Lou." "Now," Lou repeated. And there was something in it that made obedience automatic. Across the room, the idle camera's tally light blinked red. Live. The man froze, not in panic, but in recalculation, so sharp it almost made a sound. His eyes flicked to the lens, then past it, searching for the safest exit that didn't look like an exit. Eddie felt his heartbeat hammering into his throat, but his hands moved anyway. He slid behind the pedestal, flipped the side panel open, and pulled a small metal plate, free, with 2 fingers. An access cover most people never noticed. Inside, taped to the inner frame, was a thin strip of 16mm leader Lou used for emergency splices. Eddie slid the film canister out of his jacket. He hadn't told Lou he'd kept it on him the whole time, and pressed it into the cavity, sealing it back with shaking hands. The man watched him do it. Then he smiled thin, controlled, almost kind. "You're making this bigger," he said, stepping backward, careful not to turn his back on the camera. "Bigger gets people hurt." Lou didn't answer. He just kept the lights on, kept the lens fed, kept the room loud, in the way professionals hated. The man retreated to the studio door, paused as if considering one last move, then slipped out with the softness of someone trained not to disturb air. A minute later, 2 uniformed police officers appeared at the far end of the corridor, too fast for coincidence, too late to look heroic. One of them spoke to Lou with the quiet deference men used when the real instructions came from somewhere else. Eddie never heard the word FBI. No one said KGB. No one explained anything that could be quoted. All Eddie got, 3 days later, was the empty feeling of a street that seemed normal again, and a brief phone call from a voice that didn't offer a name. "You did the right thing," it said. "And you didn't do it the way they expected." Then the line went dead after a single click clean.